So what I'm doing is a series, an interview series, because I run a online membership. Essentially, I run a virtual mystery school, or at least what I like to think of as a virtual mystery school. And what I would, the way I describe that is, I think in general, and obviously this is very in general, but a mystery school is a place that supports people to learn how to gain direct access to reality beyond the kind of superficial, conditioned realities that we all live in. So what you could call the paradigm that we currently live in is a conditioned set of habits of perception and habits of being and habits of thinking that we get entranced in. And mystery schools have always been a place where people essentially unlearn those habits so that they can gain direct access to the vast reality beyond, the mysteries that are often referred to as divinity or sacred. And I wanted to speak with you in that context because the thing that the thing that I immediately recognized about you when I first learned about you some years ago is that you have a profound connection to realities beyond the superficial, beyond the familiar. And I find myself very attracted to that kind of opening. And it's what I would like to support people to gain whatever, not everyone has the same capacity for direct access, but most people I find, especially the ones that would come and want to work with someone like me, have much greater potential for access than they're currently realizing. So that's where I get impassioned to support people. So I guess what I would love to start with is I would love to hear a little bit from you in terms of access to the mysteries beyond the superficial, and anything that you want to start with in terms of your own experience of that and your own recognition of why it's so significant for the world that more and more of us gain those kinds of capacities.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for sharing what you shared, Jeff. And I have to say that I think this service with a capital S that you bring to the world, it feels so important and so needed, especially at this time. And I think it's really wonderful that you're offering this kind of space, this kind of platform, this kind of insight, space of insight to other people. So I want to thank you for bringing that to us. With regard to my story, and I think this is really important, is that I can only speak from personal experience. And this is it's what marks my path, is that everything I speak of, everything I write of, is direct personal experience. And just to mention this because it relates directly, is my new book, which will be out next year, which I don't want to mention the title of at the moment because it's quite a special title, but I will do. Maybe we can talk again. The first third of the book is about the sum total thus far in my life of my direct metaphysical experience. So it's not just the spiritual, it's the metaphysical. Let's see where we start with that. And please do pause me if you need to come in and I'm going a bit too far with it. I guess really my journey began, I was very aware of other dimensions, other energies when I was a very young child. I could sense them, I could feel them. I had a couple of direct experiences with them which were not so positive, which I've written about in the new book. When I was very young, and I would be lying in bed, and my parents would have just put me to bed. I'd be lying in bed, and suddenly the covers would be pulled over my head and pinned down, and I was writhing and screaming because I couldn't breathe. And it was as if there was a human being just holding these covers down. And my parents would come running up the stairs, and everything would look fine, and I'd be in this terrible fluster, and they'd be like, "What's wrong?" And it's like, "Well, somebody was here, something was here. It was holding the covers down. I couldn't breathe." And they're like, "No, everything's fine, look." And the bed was perfectly made. My mum was absolutely perfect at making beds. You kind of just slide in like you were sliding into an envelope, and it was wonderful. So it kind of started there. I had a real strong sense of what many people would describe as God. As my little child mind thought at the time, it must be God. I had a very strong sense of that as a very young child. That ran all the way through my childhood. And various experiences of, what's the word? When you imagine something's going to happen, you have a sense something's going to happen. Premonition, that's right. Lots of premonitions, a photogenic memory, and so it went on. And then when I was 16, I began what I call, in my own experience, the ascension process. It started for me when I was 16. And again, this is something I've written about in the new book, the 12 phases of ascension, which is way too deep to go into right here. It's a process that when we start to awaken, or we start to remember, because, we're not awakening really, we're reawakening. So when my reawakening started when I was 16, I went into this, and it's various stages of intense physical experiences, and a kind of a shifting that begins to happen on the physical, the emotional, the mental, and the psychic, the energetic, and the spiritual levels. That all starts to shift and reconfigure, and it can be extremely uncomfortable physically. So that began for me at 16. At 17, I fainted unexpectedly, and I found myself, it happened twice within like 20 minutes. And on both occasions, I found myself hurtling down a long, dark tunnel, the proverbial long, dark tunnel, with the proverbial light at the end of it. And just before I reached that light, on both occasions, I came round. And that changed my personality overnight. So I went from being an incredibly positive, confident, outgoing, quite sassy, teenager, to an introvert who was plagued by every phobia you can imagine. I was agoraphobic, claustrophobic, sociophobic, and this went on all the way through my 20s. That was the kind of the beginning, really, of my spiritual awakening, reawakening. At the same time, I discovered Omran Mikhail Ivanov through a friend who was very closely connected with him. And I started to read his works, and I was blown away, because I came from an atheist background. My father was an atheist, and my mother, her relationship with the Almighty, as it were, was God pays debts without money. This mention happened. So just to quickly go through this. So I discovered Omran at the same time that I discovered Jung, and I discovered Gandhi. And lights, as it were, really formed the foundation of where I was going. So they became like foundation stones. And then I got into my very, very early 20s. Well, before then, I actually became vegan. I decided I really wanted to work on purity. This was all sparked by Omran and the works I was reading from him around purity and how that really impacts the spirit and our capacity to connect with the higher realms and higher dimensions. And I feel that purifying is the number one key to walking through various portals and doorways into other dimensional realities and consciousness. So I've never drunk alcohol, I've never smoked, I've never done any drugs. I've been teetotal pretty much all my life, apart from one episode when I was 16. I got hopelessly drunk on Pernod, and I just thought, goodness, what is this? No, not for me. I kind of really went on this really big purification process, and have been on that ever since. And at first it was physical, And then I came to realize that it was purifying at an emotional level, a mental level, a psychological level, a psychic level, an energetic level. And then, of course, when we go into the psychic and energetic levels, we're going into the realms of our karma, coming to understand what's there karmically and how and where we need to clear that. And then we move on from there onto understanding the ancestors and what we're clearing for the ancestors, and for them to be able to return without those old stories, because we are doing it for them. As I've said many times, it ends here with our generations. And then from the ancestors, of course, one realizes one is also people that are on this path, not just myself, but all of us are on this path of, in quotes, purification, close quotes, are also clearing for the collective. When we start to add it all up, that we're clearing for ourselves, we're clearing for our ancestors, we're clearing for the generations to come, we're clearing for the collective, and then it goes even beyond that in terms of what we're clearing as a being on this earth, and how that reaches out into space, as it were. We're doing a lot. That really was my 20s. My 20s were all about that. And lots of psychic experiences along the way, seeing auras, seeing colours, perception, intuition. I started to work at 19 as in quotes, a psychic, which I left that behind in my late 20s and realised that I wanted to be coming from the crown chakra, the throat, rather than the sacral and the solar plexus in the throat. So I just wanted to shift that up from psychic to channel, and that purification process enabled. And then I discovered psychotherapy, transpersonal psychotherapy, and I came to understand how instrumental this is for our reconnection and our reawakening. Instrumental. And I trained as a psychosynthesis psychotherapist, and I also did a huge amount of studying and training in core process psychotherapy. And I came to realize that without the psychological grounding, spiritually we can be like balloons. It's what I call balloon syndrome, floating up in the air. But we need to understand our own process, our own psychological selves, in order to come into a really integrated place within ourselves. I spent 10 years plumbing the depths of my own psychological being. And so that took me there. And then I started to move into the understanding an arena of conscious evolution, and coming to understand that for me personally, this is the new spirituality, because we know that religion is falling away, not part of the new paradigm for sure. And people, I think generally, quite not people like ourselves, but those that are coming to the edge of awakening, are still wary of terms like spiritual, certainly wary of terms like religious. Spiritual can be lumped in with, in quotes, hippies, close quotes, So I feel that a really grounded terminology that I think is palatable and acceptable to all walks of life is evolution. So I personally view conscious evolution as a new spirituality, and that's the arena I then came into. And then I finally looked back, coming full circle here, so I can hand the talking stick back to you. I came full circle, and I realized that when I discovered Omran, Jung, and Gandhi at 17 years of age, these were the foundation stones for the three major foundation stones in my own work, which is psychological integration, which was Jung, conscious evolution, which was Gandhi, and spiritual awakening, which was Omran. This is kind of how I arrived, where I arrived. And along the way, just to add this final piece, which we can open up if you wish to, in 1997, through intensely earnest prayer to the higher realms, which I have always felt this connection with, I prayed and I prayed and I purified and I purified and I prayed and I purified. And I reached this point where I was able to pray from the purest place to please, to my spiritual friends up there, please help me to make the most of this lifetime. Put me where you need me to be and give me a directive. I'm a vessel. Please work through me and work with me. And very, very shortly after that, I had my very first out-of-body experience in June 1997, which is another pathway if we want to open that up. That lasted for 5 years, and it was phenomenal. And that really was journeying in other dimensions and other worlds. And of course, all of this I'm sharing with you is in the new book. It was time to share it all, really, like any of this openly. And then so that went on from 97 to 2002. And then in March 2002, I collapsed. I died. I came back. And again, for the second time in this lifetime, I came back feeling like I was a different being, but I was just more of the being that I am expressed, more of the higher self that was able to come in. But it took me 7 years to recover from that. And that itself is a journey and a story.
Oh my goodness. So many places we could jump off of, and how amazing that you are now going to be collecting all of that into a book. And I guess the place that I want to jump off of, I'm sure we'll get to a lot of things. I mean, I really resonate with so much of your story. And one of the things you said fairly early on was that we are not awakening, but reawakening. And that has also been my experience. I was living in a spiritual practice community for about 10 years when I ended up on a long retreat, a 2-month retreat in 2001. And at some point in the middle of that retreat, I was meditating and I experienced myself blow up to become the size of the universe. So I saw my vision go through the ceiling of the meditation hall and then above the town that we were in. And then I saw the whole earth below me. And eventually I just saw all of the stars of the universe inside my body. And I felt this sense of pure elation, ecstatic peace. And I remembered that I used to do that when I was very young. I would lock myself in my parents' bathroom and I would stare into my own eyes in the mirror until I blew up the size of the universe and experienced that kind of ecstasy. And then I would shrink back down to myself at 3 or 4 years old and then, unlock the door and leave. I never told anyone about it. And then one day I couldn't do it. And then evidently I completely forgot about it, because it wasn't until now, many years later, when I was on that retreat, that I realized that I remembered that I would do that regularly when I was very small. And suddenly my whole spiritual path, the reason why I never fit in when I was younger. And then as soon as very soon after graduating from college, I realized I wasn't really fitting into the world. And then I joined a spiritual community, and my whole path made more sense when I realized that there was something that I had been awake to that I had forgotten, that I needed to find. And it is my belief that that's true of many of us. There's a professor at Rice University whom I'm actually going to interview for this series. He's a religious studies professor named Jeffrey Kripal. And, he believes that many of us have not only had previous experiences of that type, but are still having them, but that the social and cultural conditioning is so strong that we essentially filter them out of perception before we even become conscious of them. And that really also resonates with me, that these mystical experiences of other realms and other dimensions are available all the time. It's just they're being filtered out by the perceptual habits of the current paradigm, which is why I sometimes think of a mystery school more as a place where you unlearn the habits of the current paradigm so that you are more open. And I guess where I would love to go with that, and what I'd be curious to hear from you, given the story you just shared, your own journey to deeper awakening and deeper access to the realms beyond the familiar. If you were to think about people who feel the kind of yearning that I think, both you and I and many others do feel, I believe a lot of that's coming from forgotten memories of previous connections to the divine. But these people come together and they're wanting something. They're not exactly sure what. I'd be curious to know how you think it's possible to support people to gain deeper access to the mysterious realms beyond the familiar.
Yeah. I think there's just my initial feelings on that are that there's two levels. We have the physical level, the practical level, and then we have the more, again, psychological and energetic level. So my thoughts were going in the direction when you were speaking of the classic. It sounds like a cliche, but it really is about remembering that we are love in capitals. Because for me, the word I would use to sort of replace in quotes God is source in capital letters or love in capital letters, because they're both the same thing. God, source, love, it's all the same thing. It's love. Fundamentally, we come from love. We are love, and to love we return. So my sense is that within the memory, the soul memory, I think at some level the cellular memory, within the sort of the spiritual DNA, we do remember, even if it's deeply unconscious. We have a sense, a hunch, a gnosis that we come from love, that there is an entirely different experience of being. Somehow or other we recall that. And I think that in varying stages of, in quotes, awakening, close quotes, or reawakening, we have greater to lesser or lesser to greater degrees of experience of that. And my sense is that the more we open to ourselves, the more that we are able to, again, it sounds cliche, love ourselves, which is not, from the human personality perspective, the easiest thing to do. Because in that human personality is a smorgasbord of history. And as we said at the beginning, personal, ancestral, collective, and so it goes on. So we have this kind of this bag of history that we've come here to work through, and that sometimes creates a barrier, what I call the self with a small s, which is linked to the unintegrated ego, and the self with a capital S, the authentic self. So we have the self with a small s, which is the personality self, the adapted self, and then we have the self with a capital S, which is the authentic self. And it's the connected self. It's the self that remembers who it is, where it's from, what it is. And the self with a small s doesn't remember that, because the experience of the self with a small s, let's call it the adapted self, is of the personality. So when we are located within the personality within ourselves, we are at a further distance away from the truth of who we really are. And it's on this process of our own psychological integration, conscious evolution, and spiritual awakening that we come closer and closer and closer to embodying the state of self with a capital S, authentic self. And this is when we start to really remember, we start to really get this sense of the love that we are. So my feeling again is that how we access this, and this is what we have to be really careful of, I notice this all around me in the spiritual community, is there are so many people who are spiritually awake, and they are like shining stars, they're bright, yet there is the shadow side, which is the psychological, that if that has not been worked through, it is impossible to live the fullness of the truth of who we really are here on this planet. So we have to do the work on ourselves, and I will stand by this till I take the last breath in this body, that we have to do this work on ourselves. Now, things are different. You know, if we look at, in quotes, psychotherapy from the 1970s, when it first began to just conceptualize into the collective psyche, with the presence of the asteroid Chiron being discovered in 1997. Chiron, as an asteroid astrologically, is the wounded healer. It came into the collective psyche at the precise time that we were preparing to be able to do this work as a collective, as it were, in a way we hadn't done this before. So we had this kind of phase between sort of late 1970s, really I would say until 1999, which is when we had the total solar eclipse of the total solar eclipse in 1999, August the 11th, 1999, which was instrumental. And this phase between 1999 and 2012 was the phase that the ancient Maya referred to as the quickening. And this was the phase where humanity, especially awakening humanity, was going to go through its most rapid acceleration ever in terms of its psychological, conscious, and spiritual awakening. So the point I'm making here is that we had a certain way of working on ourselves up until 1999. And then again, everything changed. We went to the next level. So now, what would have taken 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 years for someone to clear, who was earnestly clearing prior to 1999, can take those of us now who are on this path months to clear. Because that is the energetics of the times. So this is why it's so important to keep going back to clearing, 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 because the deeper we go within ourselves in terms of our clearing, the higher we can connect. And this is how we connect. This is how we integrate what I call the unintegrated ego, because an integrated ego is very valuable. It's a protector, it's an aid, it's a colleague, but it's not in the driving seat. And in most people's lives, the unintegrated ego is in the driving seat. And the soul self, let's call it the soul self, is in the back of the car, out of control. You know, it's not in control of the vehicle, as it were, of the life. So when we integrate the self, the self with a small s, we integrate that self into the self with a capital S, we start to really connect to the higher self. So as I see it, the self with a capital S is the bridge between the small self with a small s and the higher self. And when we look at the higher self is the bridge between the self with a capital S and the soul. And then we have the soul as the bridge between the higher self and spirit. So we have all these kind of trajectory stages that allow us to connect more and more and more and more to source consciousness. But there is a trajectory, and we do need to do the work we've come here to do, because we are in these bodies with these personalities for a reason. And the personality is to be transcended.
I love the progression that you just laid out from the personality, you know, small s to the big S, authentic self, and then progressing all the way to spirit, which I'm assuming spirit and source are interchangeable terms.
Well, I've been doing with this the book that I've written. I've done a huge amount of deep exploration, and a lot of really connecting in with our friends in the higher dimensions to guide me as to, is there anything else we need to know? And one of the things I've included in the book, which is something I've never spoken of before because I only connected with it when I was writing the book and I was in the meditation, is a really big question that came in for me very, very strongly. Is there a reality beyond source? Source, the ultimate expression of our capacity for connection in this particular kind of universe, as it were. So my sense is that we have self with a small s. And I also believe that we are humans, souls incarnate in human form, but the way I see it is we are aspects of soul incarnate in human form. That there is, if we think about the pint pot and we think about the quart, we only get a pint of the soul in human form. The quart, the rest of it remains out of body places. So I ask these really deep questions about, is there another state of being beyond soul? And is there a beyond source reality? And are there beings in the vast beyond that are in this kind of, I won't call it universe as in talking about a normal universe, I'm just talking about the universe of the sum total of experience of all beings that are this side of source, as it were. Are there beings this side of source who do not have a soul? Because that's not meant to be their experience. So all these different questions came up for me. But I do wonder if there is a beyond source reality. And that's something I share in the book, because it's really a very important discussion. But in the context of what we're saying right now, I feel that we have this, we have aspects of the soul incarnate in human form. We come in because we know we have a personality. We know there's things to be clearing. We know there's timelines to clear. And we know that there's a bigger objective of being here in these times. And I think part of that is to birth a new paradigm, to birth a new earth, to birth a new era in human experience. Because way, way, way back beyond the history books, so far beyond anything we can recall with our memories, that may even be recorded in the earth, as it were, there has been a life experience on this planet where it was a golden age, where people did live to phenomenal ages, people did live in harmony and beauty. And then we moved into these other timelines, and I feel we're now at a time where we're beginning to transcend those timelines and move towards, again, another great golden age. But I truly believe beyond that golden age is what I call the diamond age, which is an age that has never, ever been on this planet. So all this talk we have about new paradigm, new earth, as I write about in the book, the future earth as well, because there's a new earth reality and a beyond new earth reality called the future earth reality. And I write extensively about that. It was a huge channeling that came through me in 2006, which I never shared anywhere. And I've shared it in this manuscript. And it gives a vision, not only of new earth, but the future earth beyond the new earth, that the new earth itself will be evolving towards.
That's amazing. I have two threads that I want to pick up on, but I think I'm going to go with this one first, because I find myself completely captivated by this vision of both our progression through stages to greater access of source, and also the larger progression into a new paradigm, a new earth, and as you're saying, even a future earth. And when I work with people, you were saying earlier that there are so many people that are entering, that are getting close to, are on the edge of embracing these new possibilities, and many of them are weary of words like spirituality and especially, you said, words like religion. Now, at the same time, we many people would find it difficult to follow the language that you're using right now, just because the terms are unfamiliar and because we live in a very literal age. And I'm wondering how you deal with the fact that, we essentially, the current paradigm, which we're all in, or most people are in to a much greater degree than they realize, is a kind of materialist paradigm which believes in the reality of matter. It has certain language that it uses to determine what's real and what's unreal. And then, people like us come along and we start talking about possibilities that seem so far out to the average person. And I guess this is why I feel it's so important for people to gain direct access to these possibilities so that they're able to see things for themselves. And I'm just wondering how you find that in terms of work you do with people and people's openness to these descriptions of reality, which are going to be so far outside of the norm, and how you hold that for people to invite them into an expanded perception of themselves and an expanded perception of reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear your question, and I hope that I can respond to it. You just have to flow with where I go when you're speaking. What I feel we're doing, those of us who are using this kind of language, or not even this language, just bringing in these alternative ways of approaching things, is we're sowing seeds. And so what I feel, I don't really work one-to-one with people anymore, but my contact with people is through the writing. And my intention when I'm sharing what I share is to sow seeds of remembrance, because those seeds will land. And even if it's not in this lifetime, someone may come back in another life and the seed will be ripe to sprout and to begin to bud and then blossom. So it's not always about how we can get from A to B as simply as possible, because it's all about evolution. It's all about any individual where in themselves and how ready they are to evolve to the next level within themselves, and how far they're willing to go in order to do that. In my own story, I knew that the psychological level was instrumental. And so I left no stone unturned. I just dived in there. But then I can think of someone else that I know in my life that goes back to my childhood, who would not even begin to scratch the surface of where I went, because that person is not emotionally strong enough in themselves. So we have to be ready from an evolutionary perspective, from the soul perspective for this. We're all moving at a different pace and focused on different things in different times. And some of us may be so awakened and evolved, but have chosen a life to not go in that direction, because a life is a blink of an eye, as we know, of no time. It's a blink of an eye. So to come in and have a life where you think, I just want to get a sense of what does it feel like to choose to not progress from an evolutionary perspective in any one lifetime, because I need to have that experience. Some of those people that appear not to be on a conscious awakened path are actually some incredibly awakened beings that have chosen that. So none of us really know. All we can do is individually ask ourselves, how far am I willing to go in myself to evolve as far as I can in this lifetime? What am I willing to do? That's, that is a physical, emotional, mental, psychological, intellectual, psychic, metaphysical, spiritual, beyond spiritual even, experience, whatever we're ready for. So I come back to what I was saying originally, is that for those people that might be listening to this and saying, I really do want to have a much more clearer, much more alive relationship with my higher self, with my soul, with spirit, with the higher dimensions, then I'm going to say, then look at your life, go behind closed doors, look at your diet, look at your life, look at what's in your kitchen cupboards, your bathroom cupboards, is everything in your environment making love with the environment, using products that are not in any way going to harm you when you ingest them or put them on your body, or harm the environment when they go down the sink or they go in the rubbish bag and so forth. We have to take it all the way back to ourselves. And when we are living, as far as we can, an impeccable life, then we are already clearing ourselves to bring and actually become vehicles and channels for these higher dimensional energies to flow through us and into the world. And that's why it's so important. It starts and it ends with the individual. I'm a great believer, Jeff, in before we look outside of ourselves and follow those pathways outside of ourselves that potentially can say they can lead us to nirvana, as it were, we have to realize that the only way we're really going to find that is, again, it's the cliche, is by within ourselves. That's where we find it. And we find it through our actions and our choices and our capacity or commitment to consciously evolving, psychologically integrating, and spiritually awakening.
So I want to ask you a question which is a little bit of a more personal nature, which is, I loved what you said about how you plant seeds. And I can relate to that very much, in the writings that you do, and you're planting seeds and you don't know if they'll take fruit in this lifetime or some other lifetime. And I hold that kind of vision, meaning I don't know. I loved how you described, you plant seeds, you don't know where they're supposed to sprout. And also you don't know for any given individual where they are in the journey. We're all in different places. And I just like to hold a big question mark around knowing any ideas I have about, what I think the progression is, because I know this is much bigger than me. Now, personally, I find that when I am wanting to talk about spirit and invite people into a deeper connection to source, to invite them onto the path, invite them onto their own journey, and what I want to do is encourage them to take that path seriously, to take themselves seriously, to realize that it's possible, to realize that it matters, that it's what this world needs. I find that I'm compelled to try to express myself in ways that I think people can hear, that are appeal to their current sensibilities and ways of thinking, that allow them to hear what I'm saying. And sometimes I feel like that, or sometimes I long to be able to just speak the truth more closely as I see it, or as it occurs to me, even if I don't think anybody can really, or I'm not sure that anyone will really understand me, or just think it was all crazy. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about that. Like, how do you navigate between expressing the reality as you see it and trying to write and present in ways that people can hear? And as I said, it's kind of a personal question because I'm in that contemplation myself almost always.
Well, please let me know if my response doesn't actually speak to your question. I will say this, if anyone is listening to this interview, I wrote an article recently, just as an aside for a moment, called High Functioning autism or high frequency activated, because I've had a way of being since I came back from my death experience in 2002 that would be medically diagnosed as high functioning autism, but I don't ascribe to labels at all. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because, apart from the fact that I think this is high frequency activated, and that was the big question in the article, is you can ask me a question, Jeff, and I'll be listening to you as you're sharing leading up to that question, and I'll be feeling the impressions, and I'll go with what I feel to say, and it may not speak directly to your question, so please let me know.
That is fine with me.
So picking up from what you were saying, my sense of what I want to share is I feel that, again, it comes back to balance. Again, it comes back to integration, the degree to which we're integrated, and the way we're evolving all the time, because we're evolving the whole time to stand in our center, to stand in our authority, to stand in what we know. And one of the things that I do feel very aligned with is, and I have for a long, long time, is gnosis, Gnosis, gnosis. And when I was working as a, in quotes, medium in my early 20s, I called myself a Gnostic, because the reason I started doing that work was because I just knew things. I knew them, and it wasn't just about people, it was about life. It was about everything, from how one cleans one's teeth, you know, in a way that is conducive compared to cleaning them in a way that isn't. I knew things, and I didn't know how I knew them. So in the end, I started to understand this is gnosis. And this is very, very strong for me in my life, is this sense of gnosis. And I also keep the channel really clear, Jeff. And as hard as this may be for people to believe, I genuinely do not read other people's material. I do not read articles, I do not read books. I haven't done any of this since the death experience. I've not been able to, because I returned, as it were, with a form of dyslexia to do with numbers and words. So I can write, but I can't read, because if I read, everything goes blank. Frustrating as it was to start with, I came to understand that this is to keep the channel pure, this is to keep the channel clear, so that what I am bringing through is coming directly, as it were, from source. So with regard to what you're sharing and you're asking, I just have that sense that it's in my chart as well, is that I have this configuration in my chart that enables me to bring very, very complex information and translate it into a language that most people can understand. And this is what's always at the foreground of my mind. Whenever I write anything I ever do, everything I put onto the World Shift site, everything is written with how is this going to be received? Who is going to receive it? Who am I targeting this toward? And the answer is always everybody. I have this childhood friend that I mentioned earlier, who is, from a spiritual viewpoint, someone might say is entirely unawakened, but it's all heart. And I will often think about people like that person who are not even beginning the stages of spiritual awakening, as it were, and I want to write for them as well. So I know some of what I've shared in this interview is, as you say, is a language that maybe some people would find hard to understand, because to some degree some of it's new, but that's because I knew the kind of interview we were going to have. I knew you wanted to talk on the mystery school level, so I thought I can go there. But on another interview, I would be, depending again on what the audience is, I'd be coming from a very different place. So what I do is I tune into the audience. Who's going to be reading this? Who do I want to read this? And I'm also extremely conscientious and mindful about the responsibility, about the words that I'm writing, and about how these words influence. And so I'm very, very, very careful about that.
Well, it really works out perfectly, because when I was thinking about this series, you came to mind as someone I would like to talk to. And, I think it's fair to say that for my audience, you were, in a sense, more, from one point of view, more far out than I have normally gone. But I really wanted to invite people further in, so exactly exactly what your intuition was, which is that, I was inviting the depth of your connection to spirit, which I have so much respect for and have since I heard of you. And the kind of realms that you're talking about are things that I personally am very compelled by and very moved by. And I wanted to use our conversation to create more of an invitation to the people that are connected to me, because I want to go further out. Part of what part of what I think is happening right now is I want to invite people to go further in that process towards source, to go further in the processes of purification in the way that you're describing, and clearing, so that we can, because, the whole idea of a mystery school, the reason why I've been compelled to create one sort of my whole life, and have been in different forms, is because I feel that more and more of us need to develop greater and greater access to source, so that we can bring about the new earth that you talked about, and the future earth, because this is all part of not a linear progression. I want to shy away from too much adherence to linear time, but in some much bigger way, this is all part of an evolutionary expansion. And one of the reasons I was so excited to speak with you was because it was giving me the opportunity to invite people to go deeper on the journey, to go further, toward the edges. I'm often talking to people about how if this kind of paradigm shifting awakening is what really moves you, then we all need to keep questioning, how unconventional are we willing to be? How far from the cultural norms are we willing to be? And you've really done something beautiful by helping me create an invitation to go in the directions of just further and deeper towards source, and whatever that implies in terms of the personal work we all must do, and the clearings that we must do. And one last thing I would love to get your impression of before we move on in that context is, I see the gathering that I'm creating virtually, and that I'm calling a mystery school, as a kind of co-evolutionary, co-learning. So I'm not trying to present teachers to people who want to hear them. I do that, obviously, as in this interview. But also I'm working to create the virtual means for co-evolution and co-learning, so that everyone who's engaged can interact with each other, so that we can be more of a co-learning organism, or a co-evolving organism, than a collection of students and teachers. And so I would be very curious to hear your final thoughts about that before we conclude.
Okay. Well, what comes to mind is we're talking about a new paradigm of co-evolving. And I love what you say about it not being about the teachers and the students, because that's not a new paradigm of informing. So in-forming, how we inform, and by how we're being informed. So I hear what you're saying, that for me, it's a co-evolving community because we are all mirrors for each other. So we're all serving each other, and we're all serving this journey that we're on together. So how you go about that practically, only you would know that, Jeff, because obviously it's not my arena. But in terms of co-evolving a conscious community, who are looking towards integrating and evolving and awakening in service with a capital S of birthing this new paradigm. It's what we're here for. It's one of the things, the tagline for World Shift is we were born for these times, because we were born for these times. And what we're looking to do is to raise consciousness, raise frequency, align with the frequency of love. Remember that we are love. The personality can find that extremely difficult, one, to remember, and two, to embrace, because so many people have had history where they've had another experience of disconnection. And as I say in other writings, that, all disconnection originates from trauma. And when we sort of, our wounds are formed in relationship and our wounds are healed in relationship. So by coming together as a community that is co-supporting each other, co-evolving together, collaborating together, we are empowering ourselves, because there's something about these polarities of student-teacher that are often quite disempowering, in quotes, for the one on the student end of it, and can be sometimes overinflating, perhaps, for those that are on the teacher side of it. And this is not new paradigm. New paradigm is equality. It's recognizing how we serve each other. And we're all teachers and we're all students. So for me to be able to write the words I write, and for those to resonate with other people, that's a real gift. But without the people it's resonating with, it's just going to go into nowhere. So we need each other. And also the people that I look to when I look and I think, okay, who's the audience? Who am I writing this for? And I have this whole thing, everybody. That's the teaching that comes back to me. So we're working together, because then together we co-evolve. We inspire each other. My, in quotes, audience, whoever that is, across the full spectrum of consciousness on this planet, is my inspiration. And hopefully, on occasions, I become an inspiration for the audience. But we are co-inspirers, if that's the word, co-evolvers, collaborators, and co-supporters. That's community, common unity, common union. That's what it's about, moving forward into the new paradigm.
I think with that, I'm very happy to end the interview. And I want to thank you very much for joining me and for offering the wealth of your experience to all of the listeners, and also for giving me the opportunity to invite people to an even deeper pursuit of connection to source. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much too for inviting me, and for this gift you're giving to all of us, and for all that you're doing as well. I really, really appreciate the time we've had today. Thank you very much. The gift you're giving to all of us, and for all that you're doing as well.